Start out with let's pray, and then I want to read a couple of scripture verses, and then we're going to start talking about World War I and some things that happened between then and World War II and also World War II. I'd like to try and get into both of those subjects tonight. That's why we're going to dive right in with the overhead projector after just a few minutes. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, we thank Thee, Lord, for Thy blessings, for all Thy goodness, grace, and mercy, for all that Thou hast helped us with. We thank Thee, Lord, for understanding of spiritual things, and that through Thy word we have this understanding and wisdom. For we know that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and I pray that there would be a great fear of Thee here this night among all of us, that great respect that we must have for Thee, O Lord, in order to be right in Thy sight. I pray that Thou wouldst help us now to learn, that our memories would be sharp and clear, that our understanding would be enhanced by Thy Spirit and by Thy power. I pray that Thou wouldst bind every unclean spirit, every devil, every hindering force in the name of the Lord Jesus, and that we'd make the best use of this time to the glory of Thy kingdom. Help us to learn of Thee and to learn these things that we might be a better witness. And we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus through the power of Thy saving blood. Amen. Okay? I'd like to read from the book of Matthew. And I think I read some of this last time. I'd like to read just a little more again, and then over into Luke. And the reason I'm reading this is it tells of war. Did you know the Bible tells of war? It says that the intensified war involving so many nations would be a sign of the end. You see, there were always wars in the world, but never, ever, ever had there been a world war until 1914. The whole world at war. Who had ever heard of such a thing? You see, there have been conquests, there have been battles. Empires had risen and fallen as conquests were made. But as far as an actual war where you have many diversified nations, the entire globe, Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, North and South, every direction of the compass, the whole world was fighting. The whole world was at war. That had not happened before 1914. And then it happened again 20 years later. The unthinkable happened again. You see, World War I, when it ended, it was said to be the war to end all wars. It was called the Great War, and there was never to be another one. People should have learned their lesson. Nations should have learned, and never again would the whole world fight. But it happened again. What happened twice could happen a third time. And I think we are right now facing some very serious situations. And it helps us to understand what has happened and what kind of dark forces made these things happen. And then understand that these dark forces are still at work. The devil's not retired yet. He's still hard at work. He uses people. He uses nations, presidents, kings. Wouldn't it make sense that the devil, and there is one, all you have to do is look around at people, and you can verify that, look around at situations. And like one person was arguing with me one time. He said, I don't believe in a devil. There's no devil. And I said, well, just listening to you proves to me there is one. See? But, and so is the case. I mean, just watch the misbehavior of people, and you can tell there's an evil spirit running around, lurking around, and trying to do all the damage you can. Wouldn't it make sense that this foul spirit then, these principalities, these powers, this hierarchy of hell, wouldn't you think it would make sense for them to try to gain control of the important people of the world? The senators, the congressmen, the kings, the princes, the heads of state, prime ministers, whatever the case may be. Of course, by using these people and by using the people that control the money systems, they can thus control and inject an evil poison in the veins of all the people concerned, you see? In other words, everybody's affected by these things. If you have your Bible, if you don't, just listen. If you have it, you can follow along with me. But I want to go over to Matthew chapter 24 for a minute. Some amazing things happen here. A question is asked in Matthew 24, when would the end of the world come? What would be the sign of the Lord's coming? Listen to the very profound answer the Lord gives. For one thing, and I'm in verse 4, of Matthew 24. And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. In other words, there'll be false religions that would rise up. And there'll be antichrists, people who would stand up instead of Christ. Now, the next thing he says is, and listen carefully, because this is what we're going to study tonight. In verse 6, he said, Ye shall hear of wars, and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. When you hear these wars and rumors of wars, the end is not yet. Now watch verse 7. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Do you see the connotation here? A nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. The connotation is many nations, many kingdoms involved. This is one of the great signs of the end of the world, that you're living in the last times. That did happen in 1914, and I believe we're still in those last days. In fact, we're a lot farther into them now than when this period of time started. So nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. Those of you who have had, maybe none of us here are that old, I don't think, but you may remember the Dust Bowl in this country, having heard about it. See, I understand that in the history courses in most public schools, they don't teach much. And so you may not have heard of some of these things. Some of the things I'm going to teach you tonight, they wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. Because the textbooks for the public schools are supplied by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation is conspiratorial. And if they're going to supply the textbooks, they're going to want you to teach only what they want you to teach, and nothing else. Nothing that would incriminate them. Do you realize there are some very powerful people in very high places that have spent years and years and years building up an antichrist system in the public school system, in the libraries, in all the institutions of higher learning? They've spent a lot of time and a lot of money building up a facade and a falsehood, and have rewritten history and interwoven it with lies and with twists and spin-offs that are really misleading. Do you think they're going to settle for anybody exposing that? They will protect it. They'll guard it with their life. I know it's kind of interesting to me anyway that Ruth took one of my newsletters to school when she was still going to public school, and the principal got a hold of it and he banned the Last Trumpet newsletter from the school because I was telling the truth about Pearl Harbor, that it was really Roosevelt that set up the whole sneak attack and knew all about it happening long before it happened. That it was Roosevelt who commanded that no rescues be made for the men that were trapped inside the ships, and so they were pounding on the bulkheads wanting to be rescued, and they ended up suffocating because Roosevelt refused to have 2,800 of them rescued. They had to have dead bodies. Now, you talk to a teacher about that and they'll blow their cork right off the top of their head, because that is hidden material. People aren't supposed to know that. But if you spend a little time in some libraries, especially the Library of Congress, if you ever get out to Washington, D.C., all these things are there. People just don't look. You don't have to go to Washington. You can go to this library. These things that I'm telling you are all there. Individual historians have written books and documented these things. There's nothing I'm telling you that's so odd and bizarre. Other than that, you just never hear of it. But it's there and it's available for the reading. If people would care to turn off the stupid idiot lantern long enough to go and read. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. So there would be a great time of sorrow that would be coming. And the real kickoff for this would be when the world would be at war, the entire world. That was a sign to us. A lot of people saw it and missed it. In addition to that, let's go over to the book of Luke. In the 25th verse of Luke 21, Luke 21:25, and there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations. Distress of what? Of nations. Is there anything more stressful and distressful than a world at war, nations at war? With perplexity. The Greek word for perplexity there is aporia. Aporia means unable to find a way out. totally trapped, cannot get out of it. The sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when ye see these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. There are so many signs in the sun, moon, and stars in the heavens that people fail to see. You just don't hear a whole lot about it because the press, the media, radio, television, newspapers are controlled. Who owns them? The bankers in New York. Who are they working for? The House of Rothschild, who works for Satan. It's all managed news. In fact, a Pentagon press agent during the Kennedy administration by the name of Arthur Sylvester made the statement that the government has the inherent right to lie to the people. That's quote unquote. No paraphrase. Does anybody have a right to lie? Of course not. But they, by their very nature, they feel that they do. They are in control. They will tell you what they feel is best for you, whether it's true or not. You know, one of the things that happen that people have forgotten, see, the devil knows the propensity of people to forget. But a lot of things have taken place. I remember reading about this. I remember my mother telling me about this. Just before the United States entered the war, just before Pearl Harbor was attacked, it was all over the news at that time. See, the press wasn't totally controlled in those days like it is now. It was controlled to a certain extent, but there were a lot of freelance writers and people that got the word out. But there was something that could not be ignored. One night in New York City, in the dark hours of the early morning, after midnight, there was an eerie sound coming from the sky. It came from everywhere over New York City. A sound of people, particularly women, but mixed voices, weeping and wailing in sorrow as if they had lost all their children. They heard this sound. It was loud. It was a very loud mourning, weeping sound all over above all of New York City. And they never could answer it. They couldn't figure out what had happened. No loudspeakers could have produced that. No aircraft flying overhead could have simulated that sound, especially in those days, because the technology wouldn't have been there, and if it was, why would they do it? The fact is, I believe that was a sign from the Lord that the nation was about to enter in with the world to a very severe time of trouble and sorrow, and so it did turn out to be. And that has never ended. That time of grief and sorrow has never really ended. Now, what I'd like to do is give you a little history and help you understand what did happen. How many here feel like they're somewhat, well, let me do it this way. Do we have any experts here in World War I? Do we have anybody that has a pretty good knowledge, you think, of World War I? Does anybody here know anything at all about World War I? I have found in talking to people, there are three things that, there are actually three wars that people are incredibly ignorant of. World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. Misinformed. Now, we learn about the Revolutionary War, and of course they're rewriting that now too. They're pretty much taking it out of the books. The Revolutionary War. I mean, that which broke this country away from England, at least on the surface. And the Civil War has been pretty much distorted historically. But people seem to know very little about World War I and II and Vietnam. All right? Vietnam is pretty easy to document, too, because there are a lot of people over there that are still living. It was only 25 years ago. But what we're talking about now is a world at war. You see, during the early days of this century, the early 1900s, actually even the late 1800s, there were some isms, ISM, isms that started to rise up. Do you remember me teaching about how this little island over here called Great Britain, which is composed of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, that this little empire here started to set up what were called crown colonies all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, the Far East, down here in the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar. They had all these little colonies and little strongholds and fortresses, and they controlled all the waterways. That little country controlled every waterway. They controlled the Strait of Magellan. How? Falkland Islands. They controlled the Far East from Hong Kong and Singapore. They controlled the Mediterranean Sea from Gibraltar. They controlled the North Atlantic because they were right there. I mean, they had really all the major waterways locked up. And countries, in order to ship anything, had to pay tribute to England. Now, you don't hear about that in the history books either. The reason being, that would implicate this country as being a conspiratorial power, a power that has never been attributed to it. Okay, this is the land of hope and glory, they call it, right? But it's the land of shenanigans and chicanery, really. Did you know this little island here called England, or Great Britain rather, that little island is considered by the witches to be the holy land of all witchcraft? That the only place there are more witches than here is in San Francisco, California, in the Bay Area? That this is the head of the Masonic Lodge worldwide? The Lord Mayor of London heads the Masonic Lodge? There are a lot of things that go on. London, which is not the capital of England, Westminster is the capital of England. Did you know that? But London is the head of the Crown. The Crown is like the Federal Reserve is here. In fact, the Crown owns the Federal Reserve in the United States. Now, they don't teach you that in school either, do they? You don't even get that in Economics 101 or anything thereafter. They don't want you to know that. Actually, the United States is controlled from over here to this very day. That's why they've always said war with England means war with the United States. That if any country in Europe ever went, or any country anywhere ever went to war with England, the United States would find a way to get into it. They're inseparable. So what you have here then is a great power, the biggest and greatest naval power in the world. And Sir Winston Churchill was the Lord of the Admiralty. He was the head of the entire Navy of Britain during World War I. But just prior to World War I, as I said, there were some isms that rose up. There was something called Pan-Germanism. All the Germanic people began to unify. This came from the efforts of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Blut und Eisen was his slogan, blood and iron. And he started to bring about a nationalistic spirit. The Austrian people, the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, the entire area of Germany, Prussia, even on into Poland. He claimed part of Poland was Germanic. So this wasn't only Hitler's claims, the Kaiser claimed these things too. But they wanted to break away from Britain's control of the seas, and be able to ship and circumvent paying tribute to Britain. Pan-Germanism, that the German people were a superior people. But at the same time, they're over in this area, from Poland over into the European part of Russia, there was something called Pan-Slavism, the Slavic people. They believed they were a special people, that they had the right to break out of their landlocked area and ship freely throughout the world and thus make a lot of money, have a world market. So the Germans wanted a world market, Britain stifled them. The Slavs, including Mother Russia, mother of all the Slavic people, wanted to break out and be able to ship freely and become a viable, wealthy power in the world. Over here in Southeast Asia, the Japanese claimed that they were the ancient people from the land of the rising sun, that this area and all these little islands throughout the South Pacific and the Far East and so forth, that all of these islands really belong to what they called their Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Okay? So you had these isms rising up. Do you see what was happening? The way was being paved for a war. There was a nationalistic spirit in these areas, and they were ready to defend their ism. These were ready to defend their ism. Germany was ready to defend its ism and go on the offense if necessary. And everybody was against Britain. There's something else I think is kind of interesting about World War I. The heads of state of any important nation were all related. Who was the King of England during World War I? George. Who was the grandmother of King George? Victoria. Queen Victoria. Now George had a brother, Willie, in Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm. Okay? He had another brother over here in Russia, Nicky, Tsar Nicholas. He had another brother who happened to be the king of Greece. See, you had all these, it was all a family. The World War I was a little family deal, see. A bunch of relatives couldn't get along. No, it was really more than that, but that was part of it. In fact, the Russian people have never been able to pick a ruler from their own people. It never worked. They had to go elsewhere to get a ruler. Okay? Usually you would think the head of Russia would be a Russian, right? Not so. Or the head of Germany would be a German. No, not really. They kind of nationalized themselves. He didn't call himself Kaiser Willie. He called himself Kaiser Wilhelm. So anyway, a number of things were happening in Europe that were very intriguing. But what happened is also alliances formed. Austria and Hungary formed an alliance. They said if anybody attacks Austria, Hungary is going to enter the war and defend Austria. Likewise, Austria would defend Hungary. In addition to that, Germany signed a pact with Austria-Hungary, and they said if anybody messes around with Austria-Hungary, Germany's going to come and fight. Now that was significant because the Germans had the most powerful army in the world. And in fact, during World War II, they did also, for their size. They packed quite a punch, which is why they were winning everywhere. Now, at the same time, the Allied forces had been downscaled so much that it took them a long time to catch up. We'll get into that later. But you see what's happening here? Alliances were formed. If anybody would set the spark off, if you stack up a whole bunch of dominoes, what happens if you push the first one? We have what we call a domino effect. They all fall down, right? So what happens if you've got a whole bunch of agreements here with all these isms set up a certain way? Here's in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and into the Russian portion of... See, Russia actually, look how big it is. It involves Asia and Europe, doesn't it? So it's a huge, huge country. These isms begin to rise up, form these alliances. And the stage was set for a spark to be set off. When that was set off, all the nations rushing to the aid of each other, it would thrust the world into a war such as had never been seen before. Now, do wars happen to happen, or do they happen because somebody wants them to happen? Here again, a lot of people would have you to think that things happen to happen. They just kind of fall into place that way, and people get upset with each other, and they happen to happen. But we know that it was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt who made the statement, if it happens, it's because we planned it that way. That's what the president said. If it happens. What was he speaking in regard to? He was speaking carte blanche. He was speaking arrogantly. I'm not taking this out of context. He was basically saying irregardless of what happened, if it happens, it's because we planned it that way. See, when you give people enough power, they start to walk around like a peacock, and they'll shoot off their mouth, and that can cause some real trouble. By the way, you may be interested, just skipping up to the present time just for a moment, this country is very soon going to be in more trouble than it can handle. I don't know if you heard this today on the news, but Janet Reno has appointed a man by the name of Larry Potts to be the assistant FBI director. And this guy is hated by every militia in the country fiercely because he's the one who gave the command to shoot Mrs. Weaver while she was holding her baby. And he was the one who commanded that Waco be burned, the compound at Waco, the Branch Davidian compound, Mount Carmel they called it. This man, who was censured by his own administration, not the Clinton administration, but by his own division that he worked for. He was, I believe he was involved with the FBI and had ties, of course, with the BATF. Now he's in that second in command position with the FBI, and these militias are going to be hopping mad. So something's going to give here pretty soon. Janet Reno has been pushing and pushing and pushing. When we look at the turmoil in history, remember this, it's not over yet. Furthermore, as bad as all of this was, the worst is yet to come. Remember I made the statement that things happen because somebody wants them to happen? Behind every president, there were advisors. This is the man who really, I suppose you could pin most of the blame on for starting World War I. This man's name was, and you won't get this in history books either unless they were privately written, Edward M. House, who called himself E. Mandel House. That's what the M stood for. He was the mentor, the chief advisor, and close personal, actually best friend of Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during World War I. Actually, Woodrow Wilson ran on the campaign slogan when he ran for president. His slogan was, "Elect the man who will keep your sons out of the war." And while he was making campaign speeches about how he was going to keep the American sons out of the war, he was already planning how to get America into the war. You have to understand that politicians all have two hats, one to wear on their head and one to talk through. Now, this man, working in collusion with Sir Winston Churchill, the head of the Lord of the Admiralty of Britain, conspired a way to get the United States into the war. But first of all, I showed you his picture for a reason. I want you to remember it. Oh, by the way, his chief objective was not just war. You might say, why did he want a war? For the sole purpose of, now there were many other little spin-offs, desirable results that they got from this, but their chief objective was create a war that is so horrifying, that is so terrible, with so many nations fighting, that all the nations will cry for peace at any price. That they would form a one world government. They would all join together, join hands in the name of peace, disarm everything, and have a one world government. Yep, way back there. That was the plan of Colonel House, for he was an agent of the House of Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe. He worked for the bankers, the money changers. Kind of interesting, it was Jesus who threw the money changers out of the temple. There's something about money changers that are very contemptible. The banksters, I call them. Colonel House was an agent of the Rothschilds. It was the Rothschilds' purpose to set up a one-world government. In fact, they even picked out a name for it. It was to be called the League of Nations. Do you ever hear the League of Nations? It started, but it fizzled out because after World War I was over, the Congress of the United States absolutely forbade that this country be involved in it. Shortly after that, President Wilson became ill, very sick. They said that he was not mentally capable, really, of maintaining his office, and the truth of the matter is he died an imbecile, which was brought on by syphilis, a venereal disease. But you don't hear about that too much either, do you? So anyway, oh, by the way, I hope all of you understand the danger of venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. They are about the worst kind, and it's actually a judgment of God. Okay? A lot of people think, oh, I'd never get it, and all those people out there thought that way too that have got it. So, anyway, E. Mandel House wanted a one-world government, and he set a scheme in motion to get it. In order to have people cry for peace, 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 what do you have to have? War, war, war. To make it a universal cry for peace, all nations crying for peace, all the heads of state laying down their crowns and laying down the office that they held. In order to have that, you had to have a world war. They didn't want a little piece of the world in this. They wanted all the world in it. So it had to be a horrifying, devastating, bloody, terrible war. This is the man who engineered it, along with Winston Churchill. Here's how they set the spark off. Remember I said there was a spark had to be set off? Here you have a very important figure in Europe, Francis Ferdinand, who was the Archduke of Austria, right here. And there's his wife. They're about to get in their car. They are in a place called Sarajevo, which was in Serbia. There had been border disputes. There had been land disputes between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. There he was in Sarajevo, a place where they recently had the Olympics and now is war-torn once again. As he got into his car, a young man came running up and shot and killed him. A man who was later identified as a member of the Black Hand Society, which is an Illuministic organization. Now, a lot of these connections are not made in secular history books, and I think I can appropriately use that term secular, without God. We're going to bring the truth of the matter into this, because that's precisely what happened. Incidentally, this incident was arranged by radio, which was at that time pretty much unknown. It was invented by a man, a scientist named Nikola Tesla, and the Illuminists got it from him. Marconi did not invent the radio. Nikola Tesla did. Marconi worked in Tesla's lab and stole the design from him. And he was given credit because actually Marconi, later on, with the help of a Russian by the name of David Sarnoff, formed RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, which was financed by the New York bankers under the House of Rothschild. But they used radio to communicate the message, the timing of this, and they used a device that people didn't know existed. You know the microwave ovens that you use? There is a device in there called a magnetron that makes it work. And the magnetron, which sends out what's called a maser wave. Maser stands for microwave amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation. Just like laser, L-A-S-E-R, stands for light amplification by the stimulated emission of radiation. These things were used by the government long before we ever heard such a thing existed. In fact, everything that the government, that we now have and use in our homes, the government used before. When they were through with a clandestine use of them, then they put it on the market for us. So anyway, he was killed. And the Austrian and Hungarian alliance were so infuriated and outraged by this, they immediately declared war on Serbia. Well, when war was declared on Serbia, who came to the aid of Serbia? Serbia is what kind of people? They're Slavic, aren't they? Who is the mother of all the Slavs? Yeah, they were involved. Yugoslavia, of course, Serbia is a part of Yugoslavia. Czechoslovakia is Slovakia. Czechoslovakia was really two countries. Okay, but yeah, they entered in. But how about Mother Russia? before long you had a major war going on. The United States was not involved in it yet. And Wilson was beside himself and trying to figure out, how am I going to get the United States into the war? Why couldn't he just dive in? He had to have the people of the country welded solidly behind him, backing him completely. And that's easier said than done, isn't it? The war began, and the brains of the operation went to work. Here we have another picture of Colonel House, and here's President Wilson working together. They had another man working with them, a man by the name of Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg was a Jewish man who grew up in the ghettos of Germany, but got a job with the House of Rothschild banking dynasty. He had a Machiavellian mind. In your textbooks, it'll tell you that Paul Warburg was a self-made man. That when he came to the United States, now he was a man with a mission. He came here on orders by the House of Rothschild to help get the United States into the war. Now they said that Paul Warburg came to this country with nothing more than the clothes on his back and a paper bag in his hand. That's what the textbooks tell you. What the textbooks don't tell you is that in the paper bag was $2 million in U.S. currency. Hardly just the shirt on his back, all right? I maintain that if you've got nothing but the clothes on your back and a paper bag with $2 million in it, you're doing pretty well, especially back there. True, millions of dollars don't go as far as they used to, but it's still a lot of money. Paul Warburg was given the job of heading up the Federal Reserve, the banking system that was recently voted into being. Incidentally, it was during this time, around the time of World War I, just preceding it, when the Federal Reserve really came into being. Understand that the United States Constitution tells us that only gold and silver coin is lawful money. We understand that, right? We learned that? And that Congress was to control it. In 1913, that all changed. Because just a couple of days before Christmas, when almost all the senators had gone home for a break, this Federal Reserve Act was presented to a few hand-picked senators that were still there. And they railroaded this thing through. They passed it into law. So, anyway, he helped by controlling the monetary system. There was an interchange of funds between Europe and the United States. And this is the man working with House and working with Wilson and with Churchill that began to contrive a way to get the American people angry with Germany and Austria-Hungary. I want to put this up here one more time because this is quite important. In 1917, actually I'll just mention something about this man up here, Carroll Quigley of Harvard University. Professor Carroll Quigley wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope. And I have a copy of that. It's a very lengthy book, which is sometimes referred to as the Bill Clinton Bible. Bill Clinton studied under Carroll Quigley, who wrote this book, Tragedy and Hope. And it's very favorable. It's all about how there is a conspiracy. There is a League of Just Men, or Illuminati. That all of this is necessary to bring about a better world. And he writes it in a very positive tone, that there is a conspiracy, but it's a benevolent conspiracy. Because the majority of the people in this world are human cattle. They don't know what's best for them. That you and I don't know what's best for us religiously, politically, economically, socially, or whatever. We don't know. We're too dumb and ignorant. They have to know for us, and they have to give us what we think we need. Okay? Or what they think we need, rather. So, Dr. Quigley wrote this book. Now, if you really want to tackle it, I've got a copy of it. It's over 800 pages. But that is what has shaped, if you want to understand the mind of Bill Clinton, all you have to do is read that book. Because he has mastered that book, and he's putting it into practice right now. This man, J.P. Morgan, working with the other bankers, caused something to happen, well, we'll get into it later, But he was instrumental in pushing the U.S. into World War I to protect his loans to the British government. He was interested personally in this war too, so he worked along with House and with Warburg. In order to provide an incident, and I mentioned this last week for a few minutes, Winston Churchill and E. Mandel House were talking. The reason we know some of this is because some of the autobiographies, that could have been written. See, these men, after it's all over with and the smoke is cleared, nobody cares that much anymore, then they'll write their autobiography, and who can do anything about it, right? Churchill, Lord of the Admiralty of Britain, and E. Mandel House were talking. They were standing near Dover, the White Cliffs of Dover in England. Right here you see this little narrow strait, the English Channel. Well, right there are white cliffs. They're beautiful. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of them. The White Cliffs of Dover. E. Mandel House was standing there talking to Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill said to House, "What if I were to arrange for the Lusitania to be sunk?" And House answered, "I think war could be arranged." So what happened is the Lusitania was presented in the news as a passenger ship. There were 128 Americans on it. In truth, the Lusitania, this was later admitted by Life magazine, so then we know it's true, right? No, it's all come out now. It's no secret anymore. This was not a passenger ship. This was a ship of the line. This was a military ship. In fact, it carried more armaments on it than any other ship afloat at that time. And so according to the rules of war, Germany had a right to sink it. Question? Yeah, there were passengers on it. Passengers didn't know it was a ship of the line. Well, okay. They didn't know just by looking at the ship or by getting on. They wouldn't have known. See, what it is all of these weapons and everything were in hold. They were locked away. They weren't visible. All right? But Germany, because of their spies and their agents, they knew this was a warship. So what they did is when it left the United States, the German embassy, the Imperial German Embassy, here's a copy of their warning. They handed these leaflets out to every passenger getting on that gangplank, and they said, "Don't take this ship. If you take this ship, you're in danger. This ship could be sunk." They said, "If you get on board, we've warned you, and you get on board, you could die." The representatives from the German embassy in the United States, so they were all warned. Now, when a German U-boat, the Germans invented the submarine. And there you see a German U-boat. When they hit the Lusitania with torpedoes and sunk it, there was a great outcry as the papers said, "Passenger ship maliciously attacked by those nasty, evil Germans." See, paraphrasing a little. Germans were always depicted as these ogres with vampire teeth, and evil, wicked people. So, of course, we said that U-boat warfare was considered inhumane. Why? Okay? Why was it inhumane? If you had a U-boat, a little submarine, and you shot a big ship full of people, what would happen? You couldn't take survivors. They'd all die. They'd have no choice. I mean, you couldn't do anything for them. If you were a big ship, you could take survivors, couldn't you? But not a U-boat. Once the Lusitania was sunk, the press went to work, and they presented this as an awful, terrible travesty. Just dreadful, these awful, nasty Germans. And this was played up so big that the American people, being sympathetic, got behind the president, and it wasn't long until the United States was in the war. Okay? On the side of England, of course. Where was this all being controlled from? One would say, well, from the White House or from the Capitol building, or perhaps from number 10 Downing Street in, you know where that is, don't you? What's number 10 Downing Street? Prime Minister of England's residence, right? But it was none of those places. here on 68th Street in New York City, and it's still there. Here is the headquarters of the Illuminati in the United States, right here. That's the home of the Council on Foreign Relations, 68th Street, New York. It's the Harold Pratt building. It's still there. It's still the capital of the Illuminati in the United States. The man who set that up was one John Jacob Schiff, son of a rabbi, a Rothschild agent. Now I want to explain something to you that has reshaped history. I don't know how far we'll get into World War II, but we'll get into it a little ways. But understand something here. Have you ever heard of communism? I call it communism. Communism was actually invented by the Illuminati as an ideology so that you could have opposing forces in the world, and both of these opposing forces could be built up until they were bigger and bigger and bigger and big enough to have a final cataclysm, a final catastrophic war. Okay? Communism, the word communism was born in a Masonic lodge. St. John's Hall. St. John's Hall in New York, a York Rite Masonic lodge. In St. John's Hall in New York, two men who were paid by the Illuminists, men by the name of Marx and Engels, had put together Das Kapital and, of course, the Communist Manifesto, so they could bring forth an ideology of atheism, nihilism. Nihilism means a godless system. And that it would be absolutely controlling the people. It would be a movement of the workers, labor unions. By the way, the Allied Industrial Workers, the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, all of these labor unions are communistic. They're communistic. All labor unions are. Do you know I'm the only locksmith working in the state system that's a non-union member? Boy, do I get flack about that too, but I will not join. They keep saying, sign the green card, sign the green card. Nope. I'm the only dissenter. Praise the Lord. I don't want to join. I don't want anything to do with the labor union. They're communistic. Communism was always a movement of the workers. And the reason I mention communism here is because they had to not only come up with an ideology. Let's say you come up with a concept, a type of government, communism. You got to put it somewhere, right? Where are you going to put it? In the United States, that'd never work. Not yet. It's here now. But at that time, it wouldn't have worked. There would have been a bloodbath like you wouldn't have believed. Where would they put it? Germany? No, not big enough. It would have to start out in some country that could be absolutely controlled. The German people were too industrious and too smart. So they picked a land where there were common laborers, agrarian people. What does agrarian mean? Agrarian. Farmers. Agrarian people are farmers. Common, plain people that don't have the strength to do much of anything politically. They picked Russia as their target. There was unrest in Russia. The Tsar controlled the people. There were basically two classes, rich and poor, perfect prerequisite for communism, because Marx and Engels wrote of the proletariat, the common people, and the bourgeoisie, the rich people, controlling society, as they called it. Here's what happened. There was a man by the name of Leon Trotsky. His true name was Bronstein, another Jewish man. He lived in the Lower East Side of New York, which was known to be the habitat of hoodlums, gangs of thugs. Bronstein, who had changed his name to Trotsky, lived there. Bronstein, back in the about 1915, 1916 period of time, was seen running in and out of Jacob Schiff's palatial mansion in New York. He and over 200 trained thugs and hoodlums were gathering together on Rockefeller's Standard Oil refinery property in New Jersey and going through some kind of a mysterious training process. Now, what I'm about to tell you is the Bolshevik Revolution started in the United States, was paid for by the United States bankers. It's vital that we understand that. Communism was the biggest menace ever launched on the world, and it started in New York. Jacob Schiff was financing Trotsky. Trotsky later got together with two other men, Joseph Stalin, who was a train robber in Russia. He was known as the Jesse James of the Urals. Up in the Ural Mountains, he would go about his thievery. And there was another man named Goldman who had changed his name to Nikolai Lenin. Lenin was in Switzerland. Stalin was in Russia. Trotsky was in New York. This was the triumvirate that would start a revolution in Russia to overthrow the Tsar, Nicholas, and his family, and plant communism firmly in that nation so it could grow. What happened is, after this training process had finished, now, Trotsky was the head of a revolutionary movement called the Bolsheviki. They were bewhiskered, unkempt, very uncouth people. And he and his 200 trained thugs and hoodlums were put on a ship chartered by Jacob Schiff. And on that ship was $20 million in gold to finance the Russian Revolution. Let me tell you why this was happening. Years ago, after the French Revolution, there was something called a Congress in Vienna, which was supposed to be a one-world government setup, similar to the UN or the League of Nations. Remember, the French Revolution took place in 1789, and after the Napoleonic Wars, they had the Congress in Vienna. The Congress in Vienna would have succeeded except for one man who torpedoed the whole thing. He refused to join this league, the Tsar of Russia. Nathan Rothschild was so mad that he stood up, red-faced and furious, and said to the Tsar, "Someday, I or one of my descendants are going to kill you and your entire family." Now that vow was to be kept. Jacob Schiff, a Rothschild agent, put $20 million in a ship, put these trained thugs, the Bolsheviki under Trotsky, in that ship, and sent them off to Switzerland to rendezvous with Lenin. They were intercepted by a Canadian warship. The Canadian warship found the $20 million in gold, impounded the Bolsheviki, and President Wilson contacted the Canadian government and said, either let that ship go or the United States will not enter the war on the side of Britain. And Canada obeyed and let the ship go. It went to Switzerland, where they had a big party which involved some U.S. senators, including representatives from Germany, and a representative who had been living in the United States but was from Germany, Paul Warburg. Remember the man with the paper bag with the money in it? Warburg, who had been a banker in Germany, took these 200 thugs, the Bolsheviki, put them in sealed boxcars and arranged for them to go through Germany and into Russia. And when these sealed boxcars were opened, these men went into Russia and rabble-roused in Moscow and started a revolutionary movement, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which overthrew the Tsar, started a civil war, and eventually communism was placed in Russia. Any questions? World War I involved something that had never been used in war before. Did you ever see these little Snoopy cartoons where Snoopy's flying a Sopwith camel? Sopwith Camel was the real name of an airplane, by the way. And the Red Baron, no, he didn't invent pizza. The Red Baron was Baron von Richthofen. Now, in order to be an ace pilot, now these planes such as the Curtiss Jenny, the Albatross DV, the SPAD, and the Handley Page were fighter planes. And it's kind of funny because these World War I airplanes weren't very sophisticated. These airplanes had come along and the pilots had guns mounted right in front of them. There's a problem. Their propeller was mounted in front of them too. So as they were flying in, they were going to attack the Germans. They started firing their machine guns and shot their own propellers off and crashed. So there was a man by the name of Vickers, Vickers. You might have heard of the Vickers armament factories in Britain. He was a British man. He invented something called a screw arc propeller and machine gun assembly. What it did, as the engine would run, those of you interested in mechanics, you have a distributor that tells the spark plug when to fire. Now, can you imagine this propeller's turning at, I don't know how many RPMs. Mick, you know a little about flying. How many RPMs those things turn at? They really go, don't they? Okay, so you have a machine gun there, and what the screw arc did is it told the machine gun when to fire, coordinated with the propeller turning, so that the bullet would always miss the blade. They had twin Vickers screw arc propellers. And so they shoot right through the propeller, and then they had quite a device. Airplanes were first used in World War I. Now, in order to be an ace, a war ace, you had to shoot down 5 enemy planes. Now, the Allies had a number of aces. A triple ace had shot down how many? 15. Does anybody know who shot down, do you happen to know any names? Did you learn any of this? Who shot down more planes than anybody else in the whole war? Now, don't confuse it with World War II. We had a man from Wisconsin in World War II by the name of Bong. Did you ever hear of him? In World War II, this man shot down, I believe it was 60. But the man who shot down more planes in World War I than anybody else was the Red Baron, Baron von Richthofen. Shot down 80. 80 of them in what they called a dogfight. Okay? So this was quite a war. Planes had never been seen. They used blimps and things too, but they were easy marks, weren't they? Wouldn't you have fun shooting down blimps, huh? Especially since they flew with hydrogen instead of helium. Cowabunga! They would just really go. So, here we have a little map showing how the war was fought. Here's the Western Front, World War I. Now, Germany, of course, is over here. You got Belgium here, France down here. Most of the war was really fought in Belgium and France. 1914 to 1918. 4 years. The United States entered actually in 1917. That's when they really got into full swing. Some other weapons were used in this war that were considered inhumane. The Germans used, can you guess what it was? Gas. Poison gas. One of them was mustard gas. And that had chlorine in it. And so they had to wear gas masks. They'd send large clouds of gas out to choke people off. A lot of veterans are still in hospitals that were gassed. Their brains were damaged. Their respiratory system was damaged. There's a man in town here. I don't know if he's still living. Lester Peters was his name. A lot of people made fun of him. They call him the Butt Man. Did you ever hear of him? The reason is he go around picking, they said he picked up cigarette butts, but you know what he was doing? He's picking them up and throwing them away. He'd pick up coins and things. He'd walk around. His brain was damaged in the war by mustard gas, and was really distressing as a lot of the young people would mock him and make fun of him. But, you know, that's pretty cruel. I mean, how would you like to be over there in a line moving forward out of the trenches and a big cloud of gas hit you? I don't think that's too funny, you know? But anyway, in France here, you had major battles that took place. You had the Argonne Forest here. Verdun is over here. Major battles took place. Now, World War I was an artillery war. The shelling, the artillery was just incredible. They also used horses. Yeah. Even in the 1900s, the cavalry was made up of real horses. But they dug massive trenches. And a lot of the boundaries were rivers that they fought at, such as, let's see once, where is the Marne? Here's the Marne River right here. Major battles fought there. The Marne, Argonne Forest. The Chateau Thierry right here was a major, actually, the war had, this is the final battle line here. The Chateau Thierry is actually where the war really turned around and the Germans began to back off. So there were many battles fought all along trenches, all through here. So to fight in that war, you basically sat in a trench in order to keep from being hit by the artillery. Heavy, heavy artillery. A lot of cannon, howitzers. France basically was the main battle area. Yep, it tore France to pieces. In fact, France was so badly torn that 20 years later, when World War II broke out, the French army went on strike. They don't teach you that either. I was talking to some students at the university in Oshkosh. They were studying World War II. I said, talk to your professor about how the La Grande Armée went on strike. And, of course, they eventually ended their strike, and I believe it was 28 or 30 officers were court-martialed and shot for treason. But for a while, the whole army said, we're not going to do this again. This is ridiculous. You know, we just went through this. We're not going to do it again. So the entire French army, the La Grande Armée, refused to fight. But that's another issue. World War I was heavy shelling of artillery. There were air battles, usually not big air battles, but dogfights all over the place. And a lot of people suffered greatly. France was ripped to pieces. Finally, Germany surrendered in 1918. And do you know what that day is called? It's still honored. Armistice Day. And when is it? What month? It's November the 11th. Okay, very good. Got some good students here. Okay. You need to remember these dates. Maybe you never heard them, but now you did. Try to remember them. I mean, you got to get interested in this sort of thing. You might think, oh, it's just history. It's what made the world what it is now. And it'll tell you where it's going. Okay? Question? 1917, the war was still going. Okay, and once the Bolsheviks started their revolution in Moscow, then you had the White Russian army fighting the other army that had risen up. You had the two different forces in Russia. You started a civil war. Then they backed out of World War I. And it was strictly a Russian thing at that point. Eventually, the Tsar was captured and his entire family, and they were all executed with the exception of one daughter who fled to the United States and lived in Green Bay for a while. Anastasia, right. Yep. She actually lived in Green Bay. Okay. Bolsheviki, yeah, they did. They wore a lot of red. And their symbol was the red five-pointed star. which was, by the way, the symbol that the Rothschild family used, because there were 5 sons in the Rothschild family, the 5 points of the star. And they used that symbol above their pawn shops in Europe, under the 3 balls. Yeah, it was mostly Western Europe, the western half of Europe. Russia wasn't too involved. The Russian people were still using single-shot guns at that time, and in fact, when the Russians fought, they only had enough guns for the front line. So when people were shot down, they'd hand their rifles, the people would move up and pick up their rifles and advance the rifles and advance the rifles. And what would happen is the Germans would get out there with their machine guns, and they'd mow down 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 Russians, have lunch and go and mow down another 4,000 or 5,000 Russians. One German lieutenant was said to get up and just walk away. He said, "I can't take any more of this." He said, "I've never seen people so brave but so stupid in my whole life."
Isn't that the Gatling gun?
Yeah.
Machine gun.
Richard Jordan Gatling, right, invented that, and it was improved upon a number of times, and had rotating barrels, worked on a crank device. So anyway, that's World War I, basically. That's what happened. And as a result of it, as a result of World War I, you had something called a League of Nations that was formed. The United States never entered it. And you also had communism planted in Russia. After World War I ended, then the United States went into a very unusual time. A law was passed against any alcoholic beverages being sold in this country. That's the way it ought to be now. But that was called the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. Temperance movements. Preachers would be out there preaching on the evils of alcohol, and it was strictly forbidden. It was unconstitutional to sell liquor. Well, the churches, actually, I believe there's a number of things that took place there. I believe it was God's will, for one thing, that the stuff be outlawed. But sometimes what people meant for evil, God means for good. Okay? I think that there was still a lot of liquor sold. And we know the Kennedy family, Joseph Kennedy particularly, had a permit to sell it, even though it was illegal. He had a permit to import it, rather. It was an importation permit. That doesn't add up, does it? If it's illegal to sell it in this country, why shouldn't it be illegal to import it? He wasn't permitted to sell it, just to bring it in. But once it was in, it was sold. So it brought a vast fortune it built up the Kennedy family to where they became very rich and influential. Okay? Oh, I got to tell you this. In 1918, when the war ended, the peace treaty was signed at the Palace of France, which is called what? Yep, the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty was signed, and there were people there from all the participating nations. England had a man there, a representative, by the name of Lloyd George. Lloyd George, who was succeeded later by Neville Chamberlain, not too long after that, Lloyd George walked out of the Versailles Treaty and was asked by the news reporters, what was accomplished at the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I? What was accomplished? His answer was very profound. He said, war in 20 years. That was in 1919 when the Versailles Treaty was signed. He said, there will be war in 20 years. Now, you count ahead from 1919. 1939. Guess what? Lloyd George was right. You know why? You know what the treaty did, the Versailles Treaty? It did a number of things. For one thing, it basically set the stage for another war. nations made a pact that if any one nation would rise up, these other nations would come together against that nation and punish that nation. And so you had different alliances all laid out. You had the dominoes set up again, didn't you? That's what a treaty does. A treaty is a plan for the next war. If they do this, we'll do this. And if we do that, they'll do that, which will cause us to do this, which will cause them to do that. And back and forth and back and forth. You've got a plan for a war. Another thing that happened is Germany was put under something called the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic basically gave the Rothschild banking dynasty absolute control over Germany. Germany could only have a very tiny military force to protect its borders. The economy was handed over to the Jewish banking element, which gave Hitler a real cause later. By the way, there was a veteran of World War I that later became the head of Germany. And I'll just show you his picture. We're not going to get into World War II really tonight. But here he is in 1927 in Nuremberg. Adolf Hitler nimmt den Vorbeimarsch der SA und SS ab vor dem Führer Hauptmann Pfeffer. You know what that says? Okay. Adolf Hitler nimmt den Vorbeimarsch. Okay, in other words, there's a parade, Vorbeimarsch. Der SA and SS, those are two of his Secret Service agencies, vor dem Führer Hauptmann Pfeffer. Hauptmann Pfeffer, which means pepper, Hauptmann is general, is right here. And Hitler, of course, you can tell by that little brush under his nose there, that's called a Schnurrbart. The German word for beard is Bart. B-A-A-R-T. Almost looks like a Dutch word with those two A's. Schnurrbart. That's that little cookie duster, a little square beard. Okay? There he is. Now Hitler, you notice he's wearing something. Notice he's wearing something here. Something very few people had. See this right here? That's the German Iron Cross for bravery. Hitler was the only non-officer in the history of Germany to ever win the Iron Cross. He was a corporal in the army. It's all he ever was a corporal. And so some people wondered, how could a corporal ever rise to such power? He wasn't just a corporal. He was a corporal with the Iron Cross. And he was considered a hero by the German people. It was for bravery. What he actually did is he went out under heavy fire into the field and rescued a number of people and continued to fight when everybody else was running. So he was no coward. He was deranged, he was full of devils, but he was no coward. In fact, people were confused about Hitler. They couldn't believe the stories they heard when people actually met him. People from the media before the war got into heavy swing. They'd go and meet him. He was a very placid, peaceful, didn't seem to have any temper at all. He'd get up in the morning, he'd eat a light breakfast, he'd read and study. In the afternoon, he'd watch a few movies. You know, they had the big reel projectors. He'd go for walks, never give anybody any trouble. Come home at night and watch a few more movies and go to bed. Day after day like that. People would bring affairs of the state to him. He'd get mad, didn't want to be bothered. He was just, real laid back. But something would suddenly come over him. He'd get out in front of the people, and something would take over, and he'd make these fiery speeches. Der Dritte Reich wird 1,000 Jahren dauern. Third Reich will last 1,000 years. And of course he railed against the Jews. The reason for the inflation, the worthlessness of the money, is because the Jews control the money. The Jews control the banks, and they did. They set it up that way, see? They gave him an excuse. And he stirred up the hatred against the Jewish people. Caused the Germans to go and smash their windows and pull them out into the streets and harass them long before they ever started the concentration camps. He had to have a cause. He had to have somebody to blame. Whenever you want to start a movement, you've got to have somebody to point the finger at. Just like Janet Reno has to have the militias. Just think about that. Or she wouldn't have anything to do, would she? She's got to have those militias. She needs them. You know who needs the Ku Klux Klan more than anybody else? The NAACP. All right? Who needs the NAACP? The Ku Klux Klan. These enemies need each other or they have no cause. So there he is. We're going to stop at this point, and I'm going to start on this frame next time. We'll really get into World War II full swing, okay? But I'll give you a little close-up of this guy. You can see his Schnurrbart and his Iron Cross. I think he's wearing his Iron Cross in here. He always wore it. No, I don't see it. Oh, it's there. It's hard to see, though. But there he is. The symbol that he chose was a satanic symbol, the broken cross. That was called in German a what? Swastika. And what was his party name? I'll tell you how he came into power next week. But his Nazi party, Nazi was short for National Socialist German Workers' Party, which in German is Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. You see how you got Nazi from that? Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. The National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Brown Shirt Army. There was another movement in Germany, by the way, before Hitler came into power. It was a Spartacus movement. It was a communistic movement, and they were the black shirts. They would rabble-rouse and beat people in the streets. They were considered, the black shirts in Germany were considered the meanest, most cantankerous, wicked, cruel people there ever was, that ever existed, until they ran into Hitler's brown shirts, who whomped them but good. They were far meaner. By the way, did you ever wonder where a man who had nothing, he was impecunious, that means penniless, where he got his money for all those brown shirts and all those weapons and all that big movement as he gathered together in the beer halls in Munich, had his beer hall putsch. A beer hall putsch, that's where you put your beer down, wait for the pretzels, huh? No. A beer hall putsch was a revolutionary movement, a meeting, a rabble-rousing meeting. Where did he get his money? From the Rothschild banking dynasty. In fact, while he was in prison, he wrote a book. He didn't really write the book. Goering and Hess wrote the book and attributed the authorship to Hitler. It was called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, My Battle. And it sold throughout Germany. Where did he get the money to have that printed and marketed? He had nobody behind him. The House of Rothschild. They picked this man, this Austrian house painter and wallpaper hanger,